we're going to take a look at this passage and another one as sort of a run-up to what we'll be looking at today. And we're going to sort of entitle this one, Long Live the King. Long Live the King. And I know we can go different directions on this. And by the way, you know, we have that phrase in England, don't we? Long live the king or long live the queen. Do you know where that comes from? Comes from the Bible. There we go. Who would have thought? Who would have thought? The UK celebrates 70 years of the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. The longest, if I get this right, the longest reigning royal, certainly in England, and I believe, on good authority, that it's around the entire world as well. Is that correct? Yeah. The longest, 70 years. That's a long time no matter how you cut it. That's a long time. Couple quick pub quiz questions. Are you ready? Here we go. How many prime ministers have floated through number 10 during those 70 years? Too many. Come on. How many? Give me a number. Give me a number. How many? Right? How many? Any other numbers? 14. 14 is the number. Well done. Well done. Everyone who said 14. Number two. What is unique about the Queen's driving license? She doesn't have one. Yeah. Well, I don't know about that, but maybe not. But I thought, wow, she didn't have to sit on the seat and have someone with a little clipboard and a pen watching every move that she made. That was the most nervous 45 minutes of my entire life. She doesn't have to have a driving license. I read this little story. Let me share this with you. On a recent trip to Scotland, the Queen met some American tourists. Sure enough, it had to be Americans, right? She met some American tourists. And when the tourists asked if she lived locally, she said she had a house nearby. When asked if she'd ever met the Queen, she pointed to her security guard and said, "Not me, but he has." Interesting. We're going to take a look first. Actually, we're going to look at two different kings today and really focus on the passage that Diane read for us. We're going to look at first, as you would probably recognize, as the first king of Israel, and would we know his name? His name would be? Saul. King Saul. We're going to turn back in your Bibles, please, to 1 Samuel chapter 8. Read a couple verses there, a couple verses in chapter 9, just to get a run-up and a feel for what is going on and some of the background, some of the backdrop leading up to King David. Now, there's a huge difference. There's a huge difference between the two, because we're going to say King Saul was a king for the people. You may say, Eric, well, that's a good thing, isn't it? A king for the people. Well, hold on now. We're going to tell you more about what that means. As a bit of background, let's kind of get a running start into this whole thing. And see if you can help me a little bit with this. Because if you look around the world, there are all different kinds of government. Different kinds of government around the world. For example, there's one style that's called a democracy. A democracy. And in broad terms, that means what? Rule by the people. Rule by the people. And if you're kind of a wordsmith, if you like words, you can actually take the word democracy apart, and the first bit has its root in people. The second bit has its root in rule. So people rule by the people. And it can have its different form. Here in England, we have a parliament. In America, they have a Congress and all those sorts of things. So it's elected representatives rule by the people. There is another kind called a monarchy. England used to have a monarchy. There is still a queen, but she doesn't, or he doesn't have the powers that one time he or she had. What does a monarchy mean? Rule by one person. A little bit, mono means one. And again, rule by one person. There is another kind which we are not familiar with at all. However, it is a real kind. And it is a kind that will happen, again, at some point. It's called a theocracy. Theocracy. What does theocracy mean? Rule by God. Theo is the word for God from the Greek language. And again, rule. Rule by God. Rule by God. God truly wanted a theocracy. God wanted to be able to rule His people as God in heaven, for a people that would listen, that would listen to Him, that would obey. However, because we looked at the Garden of Eden all those many years ago, from the very beginning, people kind of shook their hand at God and said, hey, it was okay for a little while, but we're kind of tired of this. Okay? Happened with Adam and Eve. We shouldn't be surprised that we're going to come up to a time now that it had happened again. So, if we can remember, go with me now, back to the time of Father Abraham. From what I gather, is this song from Father Abraham had many sons? Yeah. Many sons had Father Abraham, and a little doodad. We had a little doodad that we did, a little dance that we did with this. Then I never understood it. Until sort of got to study this a little bit. However, Abraham had a son. The first son was called, if you remember, it was Ishmael. Then, who was not the problem? But then there was Isaac. Remember Isaac? It's all the stories of Abraham and Isaac. Isaac then grew up. He had a couple of twins. Their names were Esau and Jacob. Jacob was the one whose name was changed to Israel. So within those brief generations, we see a story developing. Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, which we are familiar with that word, had 12 sons that we now call the 12, what's the word? Tribes. Have you heard of that? 12 tribes or families of Israel, which is 12 tribes of Jacob. God wanted to be and have His people live in a theocracy where God ruled. And it worked that way for a while. Joseph, you remember, had a tough time. His brothers were jealous. Why? Because of that coat. They sold him into slavery. Where? To Egypt. Lots of things happened. Years happened. They multiplied. They were crying out because the Pharaoh said, hey, listen, these lot are getting too many. We need to set them to work because they may rise up and fight with our enemies against us. That's not a good idea. They set slave masters over them, and they became the workforce. They continued to grow. They cried out to God. God heard them, as He does. And He sent who? Who did He send? As a deliverer. Moses. He sent Moses as a deliverer. Now that started a whole sequence, a whole series of things. And the long and short of it is, as long as the miracles were there, they said, oh yes, God's number one. We like God. Well, when they saw those miracles and that the water turned to blood and all the various things, they were praising God. However, they were pretty quick to start moaning as well. Why, wait a minute now. Pharaoh's not giving us any straw to make bricks anymore. Quick to moan. Now I want you to try to remember that as we move on through. And then the time came, as after all those judgments, of those incredible miracles, those judgments that God brought, out of a mighty hand, we finally have this thing of the Passover, that one night, the death angel was going to come through, and the firstborn's life was going to be taken. And then the Jews come out with a strong hand, and all those sorts of things happen. And then they're out there in the desert. They come up to the Red Sea, After seeing all those miracles, what did they do? Why, it would have been better for us to stop in Egypt. We're stuck. Pharaoh and his army are coming behind us. There's the Red Sea in front of us. What are we going to do? Well, let's just pack it in, pack our bags, and go back to Egypt. It didn't take long. So what did God do? God brought this incredible miracle. The Red Sea opened up. They walked through, and they didn't even get their sandals muddy. Isn't that amazing? That little detail. They walked through on dry ground. Wasn't long, though, after that incredible miracle. Well, we're thirsty. Of course, I mean, yes, we need water. We need food. But God knows that, doesn't He? And God miraculously provided that water. And then after a little bit, where's the food? I think of the leeks and the tomatoes and the fish and chips and the McDonald's that was back in Egypt. Oh, we wish we were back in Egypt. God sends the manna, that bread type of stuff that would appear on the ground. And that was okay for a while. Then they started, we missed the lovely the meat that we had back in Egypt. Oh, I wish we were back there. And God's like, probably. Oi. Fine. He sends along those quails and all the things that happen. The point is what? As long as the miracles were happening, then they were happy. All that stops. Here comes the moaning and the groaning. God said, I want to be your king. I want to provide for you. I want to be the one that we have such a relationship that I will lead you and I'll protect you and I will guide you. And I want to be your king. That's what I want. However, as time moved on, it wasn't long before we come to 1 Samuel chapter 8. Everyone is probably familiar with Samuel, the young boy, remember? Who grew up and became a prophet and all these kind of things. And however, what was there about Samuel's sons? Do you remember Samuel's sons? They didn't do such a good job. So we come to a situation in 1 Samuel chapter 8. Let's just read a couple of verses. Let's read verses 4 and 5. Because Israel, they come along and say, we want a monarch. We don't want God to be king anymore. We want someone. Notice what they say. Verse 4 and 5, 1 Samuel chapter 8. It says, when all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel, there he is, and said to him, Oi, Samuel, you're a geezer. You're old. And your sons do not walk in your ways. Your sons don't obey like you. This is true, by the way. But he says, we're tired of this. We're tired of this, you and this God thing. What we want, now make us a king to judge us like what? Like all the other nations. Like all the other nations. You know, we talked before about, I wonder, if God was up in heaven, is looking down the Garden of Eden, as that story was developing, was God saying, Eve, don't do it. Don't do it. Don't do it. And how his heart broke as Eve and Adam then ate that fruit. And all the other times that happened, that the people, and we looked at Noah and how the whole earth was going their own way, and God was saying, what in the world are you doing? And I can imagine, here's another time. God saying, I wanted to be your king, but now, what they did, what did they do? They looked around all the other nations. Looked over there and said, wow, they've got a king. And he looks pretty kingly. He sits on a throne. He rides around and waves. And he makes these proclamations, and everyone bows, and wow, that's what we want. So I think what they wanted a physical person that they could see. And my mind goes, oh dear. Nope, I go the wrong direction. Did Eric miss something here? Nope. Nope, okay. Let me give you the words then. I missed out. So, okay, Israel wanted a monarch, and then we come why they were looking for the nations around them. Under that, they wanted a physical person that they could see. And we talked about the miracles and how that as long as they could see things, and they were happy. Now, take your mind back to the time there at Mount Sinai. Do you remember all that bit? How that Moses was up on top of the mountain, and after a while they got fed up and they got tired. So what did they do? They made a golden calf. Why? There's something that they could see. That's something that they could worship. And they said, we're tired of this. So then, God said, okay, if this is what you want, turn the page over, please, to 1 Samuel chapter 9. Because then we see that, let's see if I can find out where we're at here. No, not there yet. Not there yet. Okay. That Solomon was chosen as king. 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 1 and 2. This is what it says. It says, there was a man of Benjamin, whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zeruiah, the son of Bechariah, the son of Aphiah. A Benjamite, a mighty man of power.
Eric.
Yes.
It's not Saul.
I'm sorry?
Not Saul. It's Solomon.
Oh goodness, Saul. I did this one late. Yeah, Saul. I do apologize for that. Scratch that Solomon and put Saul there. Thank you very much for that, Simon. I appreciate that. Woo! Getting everyone confused today. Saul, not Solomon. Not Solomon. Let's try that again. So here we go. This person coming out to verse 2, chapter 9, 1 Samuel. And he had a choice and handsome son, whose name was not Solomon, but Saul. Thank you. There we go. There is not a more handsome person than he among the children of Israel, and from his shoulders upward he was taller than any of the people. So there was Solomon, and he was chosen as king. Now it says that he was a mighty man of power in verse 1. There's another translation that says that he was prominent. He was one of those who lived in a family that had stuff. He was one of those types. He was tall, he was handsome, and probably he was dark. So he was tall, dark, and handsome. Why, what better qualifications to be a king, right? Absolutely. And they looked at him and said, wow, he stands above everybody else. Surely, that's our king. Ooh. However, Saul was a king for the people. King for the people. God commanded Saul to do such and such a thing. He disobeyed God. God said, I want you to destroy everything in this certain battle. However, Saul then kept some of the sheep, kept some of the cattle, so forth and so on. Samuel challenged him. And Saul probably said something like this, well, I know God said to do this, but I think this is the better plan. I think it's better to bring in some of these animals, and make a sacrifice to God. Surely God would be happy with that. Makes sense, right? What did God say? He said, I want you to destroy everything. Now, that's a whole other subject, and we talked about that a bit last week. But the point is, in Scripture, this comes across again and again and again, that the scriptural idea, the concept, it is better to obey than to sacrifice. So God said, I don't want you to make up what you think is better. I want you to listen and obey. Now, for anyone who has children, you know, this is a challenge sometimes, isn't it? Yep. If I had a tuppence for every time I said the words, I don't care what you tell me, I just want to see it. Okay? I don't need a show, please do what I ask. That's all that I ask. Okay? That's all I want. And so I can imagine God is saying, I don't want all this stuff. All I want you to do is listen and obey, Israel. That's all that I want. All that I want. I wonder about us. I think God was wanting Saul to be authentic. He was wanting Saul to not just look the part of a king. He wanted him to be the kind of king that would listen to God and obey what God wanted. However, it didn't work out that way. Saul was one way on the outside, but someone else on the inside. And then as time went on, if you're familiar with the story, we don't have time to get into all that, it came out, didn't it? It came out in all different sorts of ways. Saul got angry, all different kind of things, all different sorts of things. And God said, that's it. Saul, you're finished. Then we come now to 1 Samuel chapter 16. 1 Samuel chapter 16. And we want to spend just a bit of time now as we look at not a king for the people, but king for God. King for God. Was David perfect? No. Ain't no one that's perfect. By the way, is ain't a real word now? Who's our English person here? Has anyone been in university or anything? I think I heard that ain't is actually an officially accepted word now. Okay, that's all right. Yep. It is now. Okay, it is now. We shall proclaim ain't an acceptable word. David, king for God. King for God. So, opening up there. Now, said there, verse 1. And the Lord said to Samuel, Samuel chapter 16. And the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you mourn for Saul? Saul's finished. Come on, Samuel, get up. Seeing I've rejected him from reigning over Israel, fill your horn with oil and go. I'm sending you to Jesse the Bethlehemite. Where is he living? In Bethlehem. For I've provided myself a king among his sons. So there's Samuel in Bethlehem. In Bethlehem. In verse 4. So Samuel did what the Lord said in verse 4 and went to Bethlehem. Now isn't it interesting? Have you heard the name Bethlehem before? Where do you hear Bethlehem before? What's that connected with? Jesus' what? Jesus' birthplace. Well, here we go. Isn't it amazing how that God can take something negative, what happened with Saul, turn it on its head, and even use the negative for his own purposes. Because it was prophesied out of Bethlehem shall come the Messiah. Isn't that interesting? And if you look at Matthew chapter 1, you can see there's David, then there is Joseph. So in those first verses we had read, as Diane read, God said to Samuel, Samuel, get up. Clean your face off. Pack your bags. Pack lunch. I've got a plan. I want you to go to Bethlehem because I've got another king ready to go. But then Samuel comes in and says, oh no, in verse 2, how can I go? If Saul hears about it, what's he going to do? He's going to kill me. If Saul hears about it, he's going to kill me. But the Lord said, take a heifer, take a cow with you, and say, I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. Samuel says scared. Could you understand him being scared, by the way? Of course. Why? He's going to set up another king, but there's Saul. He's got an attitude. Samuel says, who am I to go up against it? I'm afraid for my life. But God says, Samuel, here's what I want you to do. Just say to people that you've come to sacrifice and invite Jesse along, who is David's father, to the sacrifice. Good plan. Good plan. Invite Jesse, verse 3, and I'll show you what you're to do. You shall anoint one for me that I'm going to tell you. So Samuel in verse 4 did what the Lord said, which is always a good idea, by the way, and went to Bethlehem, and the elders, there we go, the elders of the town trembled at his coming. Why? They thought they were going to get told off. Right? Here comes the prophet. Have you ever had this happen to you? Someone come up to you and say, can I have a word? What's the first thing that goes in your mind? Oh no. Oh no. Right? Isn't that true? Your boss calls you in from work. Bethany, can I have a word? That's the way it is. And I'm sure the elders were the same way. Here comes Samuel, the prophet, riding into town. They thought, oh no. What did we do? What's wrong? Samuel said, no, everything's fine. Do you come peaceably, Samuel? Yes. I've come just to sacrifice to the Lord. And then we come to this incredible event that we see that David then is chosen as the king. Let's read in verse 6. Let's read verse 5. He said, peaceably I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. I've just come to sacrifice. Don't worry. Everything's good. Sanctify yourselves. Get yourselves ready. Go take a bath. And come with me to the sacrifice. Then he consecrated, he set apart Jesse and his sons. So this is the family that God has chosen. He's going to choose someone within that family. And invite them to the sacrifice. Verse 6. So it was when they came that he looked at Eliab and said, surely this is the anointed one. This is the chosen one. What happened? There's Samuel eating his fish and chips and various things, drinking his coffee. And Jesse's sons start to come into the room. And he thought, wow, yeah. Look at Eliab. He's probably tall, dark, and handsome. Yeah. Surely he's the Lord's anointed. Sure that the Lord's anointed is before him. He's the one. Now wait a minute. You would have thought Samuel by that time would have learned something, right? Did he learn anything? No. He's just like us sometimes, right? Sometimes it takes 2 times or 3 times or 10 times or 20 times till we get through here, So, Eliab was rejected. He looked apart. He looked kingly. He looked like he could do the job. But God said, no. God came in verse 7 and said, the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at the appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. And then we see an incredible comment, an incredible statement. He says that the Lord does not look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. The king for the people, Saul, what did they look at? The outward appearance. And when Samuel was there, The first son that came in, he saw, whoa, surely this is the king. Why? Because he looked like the king. But God said, no. That's not the way it works. That's not the way it works. As his sons came by, and he thought, no, that's not him, and no, not that one, and not that one, and they all filed by. And Samuel's thinking, wait a minute, did I get this wrong? Maybe I misread God's email. Maybe God sent me the wrong text and meant to go to that person or this place. He said, do you have any more sons? Yeah, but it's David. He's out taking care of the sheep. Surely. You gotta be kidding. David. So Jesse called him. Verse 10, then Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. Samuel said, the Lord's not chosen any of these. Are there any of the young men here? There remains yet the youngest. There he is, keeping the sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, send and bring him here. We will not sit down till he comes here. Verse 12, so he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy. What does that mean?
Messy.
Huh? Was that?
Messy.
No. He had like a red complexion. He had He had red cheeks, which is unusual. They're unusual. Can you think of anyone else who is like that? Okay. Remember Esau? Remember Esau? And I'm wondering in Samuel's mind, his complexion, Esau wasn't, he thought, no way. But God said, yes. And that's the one. And I can imagine in Samuel's mind, he's thinking, God, you sure you got this right? Shut up, Samuel. Just do what I tell you to do. He's the one. He's the one. He was ruddy with bright eyes, and he was good looking. Looks like the whole family had gotten the good side of the gene pool with good looks. He was good looking. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for he is the one. And Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. And Samuel rose and went to Ramah. Now, we will at one point, because there's so much about David that we would need to look at. At one point, we're working through some Old Testament events that everyone should know. We'll be looking at some biographies as well, some events, some people. And we'll take some time to look at David in a bit more detail. But we need to remember and remind ourselves that man looks at the outside, however, God sees the inside. God sees the inside. That is what's important. And that really gives me encouragement. Okay? So many people that I run across are really good at beating up themselves, me being one of them. That we think because I maybe don't look a certain part, or maybe I don't have a certain skill, or I'm not as good as this person, or I'm not as handsome as Simon, or I can't shoot a golf ball like Steve, or something like this, or I can't run like Neil, whatever. Then I can't do anything, and I'm not this or I'm not that. That really gives us encouragement that God looks at the heart. And the point is that means that everybody can be like a David. You don't have to have a certain skill. You don't have to look a certain way. You don't have to have a certain amount of money. Isn't that good news? You don't have to be in a certain tax bracket. Okay? God looks at the heart. Now, I want to have just the last few minutes here today. I want to just think about some things, some thoughts on what God saw in David. And God saw something within David that was special, that was unique, that was something that God could use. And the great thing is that each one of these are things that don't have to be unique to David. but each one of these things that all of us could develop. Number one. I think God saw within David a sense of responsibility. Now, as Samuel came into town, that was a big event. Samuel was the prophet. Where were all the brothers? Now, we see that they are lined up, came in, but where did David stay? He's out with the sheep, right? Because that was his responsibility. David probably, he could have said, listen, Samuel's here. I want to see what's happening. And he may have been able to get someone else to say, here, you take care of those sheep. I want to see what's going on inside the house. I want to be part of the action. I want to be where it's at. But David said, no. He said, I've got a responsibility. Dad gave me a job of looking after these sheep. And I'm going to stop with these sheep. You think it was fun? You think taking care of a bunch of sheep would be fun? You think they'd do like hoops and jumps and entertain them all day long? No. What do sheep do? They eat. And then they do the other thing. And then they eat some more. They roam around. Are they pretty to look at?
Maybe.
For a few seconds, and after a while it gets boring. I can imagine what it would be a life of a shepherd. The only excitement you get if one wanders off and you go out and fetch him back and all that sort of thing. Must have been boring for David. But David, I think, had a sense of responsibility. He said, this is my job, this is my responsibility. How about for us? Do we, as part of RCBC, do we have a sense of responsibility? And I think, here's the difference, I think. And we've talked about this before. I got this little thing that, it's not, first of all, it's not Eric's church. I hate that phrase. Okay? I hate that phrase, Eric. First of all, it is God's church. That's number one. Secondly, it is our church. It's our church. Yes, Eric's a pastor, but it is our church. Do we own it? Do we view it as, hey, this is my responsibility to do what God's called me to do within our church? Well, Eric, my responsibility is not standing up for. That's okay. That's okay. I cannot do what Audrey does. You set Audrey back in that kitchen. She's a machine. She's a machine back there. Okay, I could not do that. I'm thankful for that she has that skill and that ability. But do we take a sense of ownership, a sense of responsibility for our part within this local body, within this local church? And if we could do that, just as David had responsibility for his job within the family, that makes a massive amount of difference. Number two, I think David had within him an ability to trust God in a very, very dark time. Now, we could take an entire week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever, take our mind back to that battle scene where there's the Philistines on one side and Israel on the other side. They were shouting all kinds of things, and suddenly there's this big, ugly bloke that comes down and says, all right, we'll make it easy. I challenge any of you to come up to me and we'll battle. And whoever wins, if I win, then you become our slaves. If you win, we become your slaves. Now this was Goliath. Big one, big guy. Like this. Big old spear. Big old shield. And as Israel watched him, they thought, one of these kind of things. Which you can understand, right? You can understand that. And David came one time, and because his father asked him to come and see what was happening. You know, the website was down, it wasn't working. His father was trying to get updates on the battle, and he couldn't find out. David, could you go? David arrives. And who does he hear? Mr. Big Mouth Goliath. And he was defying the armies of God. He said, you're nothing but blah, 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 blah. Calling him all kinds of names. David said, who's going to go out and fight this guy? I cannot believe he's calling God these names. I can't believe he's defying the armies of God. Who's going to go up against him? Nobody. Fine, I'll do it. And you know the story. He goes up to Saul. Saul, fine. Here's your armor. You can't move. This is no good. Takes the arm off and said, well, the only thing I know is a little shepherd's weapon, a little string, a piece of leather in it, and a few little stones. It's the only thing I know. How's he going to face him? Because David had trust in God. And in a very, very dark day, in a very, very dark time, David said, the only thing I know is that God's name is to be honored. God's name is not to be slung through the mud like Goliath is doing. So David goes up against Goliath, and in one little action, David defeats Goliath. Israel wins. One thing happens after another. And David showed with actions that he trusted God. Now, if we were to go around the room today, and for everyone here who is a believer, if I was to say, do you trust God? The right answer would be, what?
Yes.
Of course. Why? Because we're in church. Right? That's the right answer. The next question would be, fine, tell me something of the last month or 2 months or 3 months or 6 months to show that you trusted God. Maybe in a difficult time. Now, I'm not going to do that because I'm not trying to be nosy. But I'm simply saying David showed that he trusted God by his actions. Words are easy, aren't they? That's where the actions come. David trusted God in a very, very dark day. Number 3, David had the ability to display grace. To display grace when attacked. Now, it's a whole different story. And it's kind of long. You have to look at it and try to pick apart the bits. But Saul knew that that God had chosen David, but Saul was angry. There's a whole series of events where Saul was trying to chase David, to kill him. But he liked David. Trying to put that together. Who needs friends like that? But so many times, David honored Saul as the king. And twice he showed that he could have killed Saul when he wanted to, but he chose not to. And he honored Saul as a king, even when it would have been easy for him to take Saul out. So David showed grace, even when attacked. If you're going to be a serious believer in this world and stand up for Jesus, there's going to be times when you may be attacked. Not physically, maybe even physically. My mind goes to our friend Dia. And I was talking to him last week for a while. And my mind, I just can't comprehend that got a little bit more of his story. How the Dia, when he became a believer, his army commander was the one who led him to Christ. Somehow word got out that this happened. The army commander was caught and executed. Diar somehow got into some truck leaving the country. He said he was in this truck for like 20 days. Had no idea where he was at any given time. He said they were able to give him food to keep him alive. My mind, I don't understand that. I can't understand that. Can't understand that. I don't get it. But Diar was at that time, in that place, when he could have been incredibly angry with all that's happening. Now his wife is still in Iran, facing the very same thing. And when I tried to tell him, what can we do to try and help? How can we? He said, you know what? Actually, it has to be down to God. God is the one. He's got to be the one to change the heart of her family, because it is such one of those situations where what do you do? I feel utterly frustrated. I have and it frustrates me because I want to do something to try and help, but I don't know what to do. I just don't know what to do. So displaying grace even when attacked. Do we do that? Do we do that? If someone says something about you, particularly as a believer, and the Scripture talks about this, as a believer, do you display grace? Do you display grace as David did? How about this one? Number 4. That he admitted sin. He admitted sin when he was confronted. Now we said in the beginning that David was not perfect, right? You remember the whole Bathsheba thing? You're familiar with all that? The Bible says when David was meant to be out, as kings who were supposed to go out to war, what did David do? He said, I'm going to take a break, stay at home, watch some television, maybe a bit of YouTube, but nothing was nice, nothing was good. So David was out on this roof, and lo and behold, who was there? But there was Bathsheba. And they said, whoa, she's very attractive. One thing after another, Bathsheba fell pregnant. You know the story of because David wanted to shift the blame. He didn't want to get caught. So he called her husband to come and arrange things so that he could stay the night with his wife. He said, no, I'm not going to do that because all my friends are out in the battle. There's no way I'm going to do that. How could I do that? Then one thing after another. He sent her husband out to the hottest part of the battle. He died. He said, oh, I'll marry Bathsheba now. Baby comes along. Nathan the prophet comes up and says, and challenges David. David, you sinned. You've done wrong. Did David say, I'm the king. I can do whatever I want? Did he say that? No. He said, yes, I've done wrong. I've done wrong. Do we have the ability to admit when we failed? Do we have that ability? David was responsible. He trusted God in a dark day. He had the ability to display grace when attacked. And he admitted sin when he was confronted. In this last little bit, I always wondered about what this was. When I came across this as sort of part of who David was, I thought, I need to check this out a little bit more. That David wanted to be, and here's the phrase, the apple of God's eye. Have you ever heard that phrase before? Yeah. I scratched my head for the longest time. What in the world is that? The apple of God's eye. All right. Now I'm going to give you the best I can on this, okay? The general idea is that if you take an apple, a nice apple, and you shine it, okay, you rub it so it gets all nice and clean, it becomes a little bit reflective. A little bit. So you can kind of shine, you can shine a light on it, you can see a little bit of something. A little bit of something. So here's the idea. He was using that idea as sort of a picture. He said, if God's eye, I know God doesn't have an eye, Jesus has an eye, but let's just try and go with me on this, okay? The apple of God's eye. He's sort of comparing two things. He says, just as this apple can show the reflection of an image, I want to be the image that is sort of, you can see in God's eye. Now, anyone who liked the NCIS, CSI, all those kind of things, you know what I'm talking about? You like the NCIS, the CIS kind of films? Right. It's amazing how in 45 minutes or an hour, they always solve it. Okay? They always solve it. Just right at the end, they solve it. It's amazing how that happens. But more often than not, and I remember this, that the really technical, clever people, they say, aha, there's someone, we caught their eye in this picture, and if we go right down into their eye, you can see a reflection. You can see the reflection that the camera didn't catch. You understand what I'm saying? So we look at the picture of their eye, and although the camera doesn't get what's happening over there, we look at that image of their eye, we get really detailed, and then we can see who done it. Who was the bad guy. Right? Because of all that technology. So their eye reflected something. David was saying, I want to be the one that God is looking at. so that my reflection is in the eye of God. He's saying, I want to be before God all the time. I want to be the one that God is looking at. I always want to be in God's presence. And I think that's what he's on about with this thing of he wants to be the apple of God's eye. He was responsible. He trusted God in a dark place. The ability to show grace. He admitted sin when confronted, and he wanted to be the apple of God's eye. So now, if today we could choose to be either like Saul or like David, which king would you rather be like? And do we show? Do we have those qualities that David had as king? Very